Hello everyone and welcome to The Secret History, Living in Your Aquarium. I'm Alexander Williamson and I am here to tell you the incredible story of the CARIDINA shrimp. Now this encompasses all the fancy CARIDINAs, so that's everything from your crystal reds, your crystal blacks, your pure red lines, pure black lines, your boas, galaxies, pintos, fishbone, blue bolts, green hulks, you name it. All those bee shrimp, the Thai bee and the Japanese bee, the tiger shrimp, the orange eye blue tiger shrimp, all of that. We're going to talk about how all those were taken from the wild as basically kind of clear versions with a little bit of coloration, a little bit of striping, or a little bit of speckling, and how humans turned them into the shrimp they are today. Now also, this will tell the story of some incredibly dedicated aquarists and fish keepers, shrimp keepers, aquascapers, and the reason why we have such a difficult time keeping a lot of these strains, especially the older strains, from some of the most expensive heirloom CARIDINA groups. So why is it that by 2010 it was so difficult to keep these shrimp alive when they came to America from Asia, versus now they're becoming almost as easy as Neocaridina or Amano shrimp to keep, and they can live in a much wider range of parameters? Like, what has caused that? And it's a really interesting story that has a lot more nuance than most people probably realize. Now, if you want to hear about Neocaridina, so cherry shrimp, blue dream, blue velvet, 24 karat gold, the gold back line, green emeralds, snowballs, all those shrimp, then I would suggest you check out my other videos, which I will either pin or put in the description, where we've gone through and I have actually covered where they started with which wild type, and then they got a mutation and that created the first cherry, and then the first cherry, then they got orange, and then they got blue. All that is listed out for you already in existing videos. But today we're going to look specifically at the fancy or ornamental bee shrimp. As a general title, we're calling them bee shrimp. Some are tigers, some are bee, some are Taiwan bee, some are Japanese bee. And we're going to untangle what all that means and then where these new crazy morphs came from. And you're going to see some of the incredible stuff that is out there in the hobby right now, and how far we've come in such a short time. So without further ado, let's jump right in. If this is a topic you like, I would greatly appreciate you hitting that thumbs up if I've earned it. And I will commence with this fascinating story right now. So let's discuss this incredible history of how CARIDINA shrimp were discovered in the wild, then domesticated, then misidentified as a completely wrong species for decades, and then again re-identified and reclassified in 2008, again in 2014, and then with the advent of affordable DNA sequencing in 2019 through 2022, we end up with the largest twist yet, which I will tell you all about when we get there in the story. But needless to say, I have been working on this video for over 6 years, waiting for the information to become unmuddled and clear so we could get a true picture of what the heck is going on and where these shrimp came from. Because for years, it has been a trade secret for many of these shrimp. Some of them go for $5,000 or $10,000 a shrimp, especially over in Asia, where they're trying to get breeding stock of a new morph or a new colorful variety that's yet to be seen. And because of that, people gave out incorrect information, or they didn't have correct information, or sometimes they were hybridizing shrimp when they were claiming it was just a mutation. And we're going to get into all of that we've been able to kind of go back through with both taxonomy and morphology of the anatomy of the shrimp, as well as the stories of people in the hobby and the evidence put together by research papers that are looking at the genome and the genomic sequencing of today's many variety of Caridina shrimp. So if that sounds like fun to you, let's buckle in. I'd love to hear, as we're starting, what everybody's favorite shrimp is, and if you see one or can think of a different one by the end of the video of this deep dive, I'd love to hear, what it is when you see that it exists versus the ones we're talking about, up to this point, the ones you know of, because there's a whole lot of new ones coming out, and we're going to touch on some of that too. All right, so we have to start somewhere. So let's start where everything starts. At the beginning. This story starts sometime in the mid to late 1980s, and a hobby that arose hand in hand with modern aquascaping, led by Takashi Amano of Japan. Now, Amano was looking for a natural way to prevent and manage algae growth in his planted aquariums and aquascapes. And he, along with a handful of other very cutting-edge aquarists, began experimenting with keeping freshwater shrimp. Not just in the sense of keeping a couple ghost shrimp or wild-caught shrimp for a little while, but actually trying to find ones that would play a role in the ecology of the tank. And that is where today's Amano shrimp came from, which is actually also a Caridina species. And we'll mention that in a moment. But the first shrimp were really similar to the Amano shrimp in that they were wild shrimp, mostly from southeastern China, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. And by the mid-1980s, there were several shrimp that began to be kept in the aquarium hobby. They were pretty hardy and flexible and easy to care for, and they actually ate a lot of algae off fine leaf plants and hair grass, moss, carpeting plants like things like baby tears and kabamba, rotalas, things that have little tiny leaves and nooks and crannies that were becoming a part of aquascaping and hadn't been a huge part of the aquarium hobby before. So it was really key to get something other than a snail or a fish that rips up plants to gently eat out the algae from the little cracks, crevices, and leaves of, say, a carpeting tank, which was also kind of a new idea, to carpet a tank in an aquascape. So let's put a pin on that really quick, and let's answer the question that a lot of shrimp keepers want to know, which is, why are Caridina shrimp so difficult to keep? Why aren't they as easy as the cherry shrimp, the blue velvet, and or Amano shrimp for that matter? Why are the Caridina lineages so difficult to keep alive? Well, they're not. Before humans started bringing out the specific color patterns, shapes, and different body morphologies of these 300 and some species of wild Caridina shrimp that now exist, according to science, they were actually pretty flexible. They lived a lot of times in subtropical or tropical Asia, where monsoon season meant that a lot of rain would fall, and all of a sudden the water would be very oxygenated, cooler, a lot less TDS, GH, and KH, and the pH was very neutral. Also in this area, karst or limestone was very common, as are a lot of botanicals that fall into creeks and rivers. So you also have this alkaline bedrock that a lot of the creeks have in it that would swing things a little alkaline or buffer things. And yet you'd also have the leaves from trees, think catappa almond leaves, that would make things acidic. And between this feast or famine giant periods of lots of water and then periods where these creeks would dry up, it made for pretty darn flexible and hardy shrimp, really. And it wasn't until humans started line breeding them and keeping them in specific tank parameters, and then telling people they were selling them to keep them at this parameter, that over time we actually took a very genetically diverse and hardy creature and narrowed it down just based mostly on its color and our desire to bring out those colors and patterns. And we end up with a bottleneck of less and less of these shrimp out there, and they're being kept in almost laboratory grade conditions, like I said, because the first shrimp keepers that were able to get these amazing color morphs were just very, very precise with how they did things, and they guarded it very close as a secret. So they kept things very, very closely monitored and the same. Now, amazingly and somewhat distressingly, all of today's Caridina fancy shrimp, the bee shrimp, have come from 3 shrimp. Now, this is kind of not true anymore, but for a long time in the hobby, all of the shrimp that originated from the Japanese bee shrimp, meaning the crystal reds and the crystal blacks, the gold bees, the blue bolts, all those, they were all from a line bred in Japan starting in the early 90s. And that line started with just 3 individuals. Only 1 was female, 2 were male, and all the offspring sprang forth from that in those tanks that were identical. Hundreds of tanks that were identically kept to the same standard of a KH of 3 to 4, a GH of 5, and a TDS of somewhere between 90 and 120, with a pH of 6.2 to 6.5, depending on who you ask and the strain. But in the wild, as I said, these are really hardy shrimp. So we actually unintentionally selected for, over at least a decade's time, shrimp that only really needed to survive in that narrow parameter. And it wasn't until generations later that we were able to take the line breeding that was done back then that made them beautiful, but also very, very difficult to keep, and undo that by introducing one either hybridized new shrimp species that were similar looking, but then could be crossbred back out so that they looked like the fancy shrimp again, or by taking other lines of fancy shrimp from other parts of Asia, Germany, America, wherever, and crossing those because enough time had drifted that their genetics had become slightly different. But at the time of the late 1990s and early 2000s, as we saw the first proliferation of crystal reds, crystal blacks, tangerine tigers, blue tigers, things like that, we actually had a heck of a time getting them. And even though Germany and Poland were ahead of the United States and Asia was ahead of them, eventually they got to the US, but only the most wealthy or hardcore and dedicated shrimp keepers were finding success in keeping them. It wasn't until like 2010, 2015 that really they became something more approachable by your average hobbyist because of all this. But let's go back and cover all that history we just skipped and talk about how we got the shrimp that we know and love today. So, when a new aquarist would acquire these very expensive and rare shrimp lines in the 1990s, it was not uncommon to see prices reaching up into the 5-figure range. Some even went for $20,000 or $30,000 a shrimp, and a lot of those are traceable back to a man by the name of Mr. Suzuki in Japan. And he was the man to copyright and patent the idea of crystal red shrimp and also crystal black shrimp, even though crystal black shrimp were in the hobby before him. But over time, breeders were inadvertently selecting shrimp that only lived in soft, slightly acidic water with that KH of 4, the GH of 5, and the temperature around 70 degrees. So not only were breeders creating beautiful new color morphs, but they were line breeding these shrimp to only tolerate very specific conditions and water parameters that it took decades to kind of undo. So eventually they did introduce more diversity, and also they hybridized strains. Now a lot of the breeders by the 2000s had become large multi-million dollar endeavors, and in places like Singapore and Hong Kong, they didn't actually want to disclose that they were going out and collecting new wild species and specimens and crossing them back with the CARIDINA that were already known from the Japanese or Taiwanese bee shrimp. So it became kind of secretive what was going on, and the genetics became a big old mess knowing what was what. And you had to kind of just go off what your breeder, where you bought them, told you. So as in the case with trying to bring out any rare trait in an organism, trying to bring out solid or vivid pigmentation in CARIDINA shrimp was mostly done by line breeding, meaning that out of a group of thousands of shrimp, they would wait for one mutation or morph, and they would select one unusual one, maybe one that had a little more white or a little more red, or more stripes in its pattern, and they would pull that aside and they would breed it, and they would hold its siblings aside and put it in a new tank, and they breed it with its siblings or its parents, and then they'd see if they got maybe a higher, maybe this time they get 2 or 3 that look like that, and then they cross them again, then maybe next time they get 25% look like that, and pretty soon you end up with new strains. I'm not going to go into all of the genetics that go into that. It's basic level breeding anything, whether it's guppies or shrimp, but over time you get these particularly desirable traits, and it requires going through a lot of shrimp, and you kind of need a lot of capital unless you're extremely lucky to get some random morph that's dominant, because usually they're recessive. So in the case of the Japanese bee shrimp, as we call it, which at the time of its discovery was called Caridina cantonensis, it was labeled the crystal black shrimp, or the black tiger shrimp, which is a little confusing because later tiger shrimp are a different species known out of the Taiwanese shrimp trade. But at the time, in the mid 80s to late 80s, there were these shrimp that were considered Caridina cantonensis coming out of Japan, and they were collected at the mouth of the Pearl River Delta, as well as several other locations in Southeast Asia. Now, in the aquarium hobby, this line breeding began to really take place all throughout Japan, and in fact, the first shrimp kept in captivity were all Chinese hillstream species from coastal China and northern Vietnam or Taiwan. So back in the 1980s, the aquarium trade in Japan and Southeast Asia was really the hub for this. And the first freshwater species to be kept alongside these Japanese bee shrimp were actually the ones that you may also know today, such as the Amano shrimp, which is the Caridina multidentata, Latin name, or the cherry shrimp and blue dream shrimp, which were scientifically known as Neocaridina davidi, but now are known usually as Caridina zangagensis, to make things more confusing. So things change over time, names and so forth. And so if you hear one name, know that they're interchangeable in these situations. But I should mention that a lot of Neocaridinas are still called Neocaridina davidi, especially in the United States, even though zangagensis or palmata can also be possible Neocaridina species. But those were also being looked at and kept, especially by the 90s. Those were being kept also and bred. And we're going to keep that all aside. Like I said, you can see my other videos for that. But with the Japanese striped shrimp, commonly now called the crystal shrimp or the Japanese bee shrimp, it was originally identified as Caridina cantonensis, and then in 2014, German biologists reclassified it as Caridina logmani. And lastly, we also saw the tiger shrimp from Taiwan, or the Taiwanese tiger, the tangerine tiger, being bred out by the 90s. And they early on had a yellow or orange shrimp that was eating algae and pretty hardy, but then they started to line breed that. And soon they had blue morphs. Now, if you know anything about crustaceans, as well as, anything from lobsters to crayfish, blue is actually a pretty common morph out of the rare morphs they can be. They could be albino, they could be melanistic or dark black, and sometimes they're just randomly blue. And that occurred, and that's where we get the blue tigers or the orange-eyed blue tigers. And that at the time was hailed as Caridina serrata, hailing from the island of Taiwan. So for today's video, we're setting aside all of that I just said. I just wanted to mention it was going on. The tigers will get crossed back in with the Japanese bee by the end of this story. But we are also going to mention that the Amano shrimp, because they are considered to be too hard to breed in aquaria, they are actually classified biologically as a lower order shrimp rather than a higher order shrimp, because they can't be bred in captivity. They are born as larval shrimp, and they need to be born in fresh water, and then as little microscopic things they float out to sea, and then in the ocean they eat plankton and they mature, and then they swim back magically to the same streams that they were hatched in. Needless to say, that's not an easy life cycle to replicate in the aquariums we keep. And while some people have done it by now, it was definitely unheard of in the 90s while these first groups of shrimp were being kind of toyed with and trying to figure out which shrimp could be kept, which ones could be modified. Well, it was clear that one that needed to be wild raised or aquaculture raised was going to be really hard to selectively breed and set aside and actually do anything with. So they kind of set that aside, and the Amano shrimp of today is very similar to the Amano shrimp that was actually one of the forerunners in the hobby. So it should also be noted that tiger shrimp, which, as I said, were originally labeled as Caridina serrata, were also being kept by some of the world's first ornamental shrimp breeders back in the early 1990s, and later German taxonomists would debate this label and propose that Caridina serrata was actually Caridina mariae or mariae, named after the wife of one of the taxonomists. Now, the first color morph in the hobby from these shrimp were known as tangerine tigers of those serrata or mariae, and those were in Taiwan and separate from the bee shrimp we're going to talk about. Later, some people would call them Taiwan bee shrimp when they mix them, but we'll get to there in a moment. So these were being bred mostly by the Taiwanese in commercial aquarium breeding facilities, as well as by Chinese and Hong Kong breeders. And that's where you see the tangerine tigers and the blue-eyed, or the blue tangerine tigers, orange-eyed blue tangerine tigers entering the hobby. And really the German, the Dutch, and the Polish first were able to get their hands on those outside of Asia. And it would be another 10 years before Americans really started to keep them in any numbers. Okay, so time out. May I suggest now is a great time to hit that like button if you're enjoying this content. And also, if you find this video useful to somebody who's breeding shrimp or somebody who's been curious about this stuff for years like myself, any diehard shrimp breeder, if you want to share it with them, that's so greatly appreciated, because you never know with the algorithm how screwy things are going to be. And I always appreciate it so much what you guys do for the channel and when you guys give me your input and stuff. So I would love to also hear, what's your favorite morph in these shrimp that I've been talking about? Of course, you're going to see some more morphs that we haven't touched on yet. as the video progresses, but I'd love to hear what it is that you think is the most beautiful or fascinating or high-end, the ones you want. Leave that in the comments for me now, and if it changes by the end, I'd love it if you left another comment with that information. Okay. Whew. So, back to the story of the Japanese bee shrimp, the Caridina cantonensis at the time, or what we now believe is actually called Caridina logmani. These are Japanese shrimp that, regardless of their scientific name, became the first crystal black shrimp in around 1988 to 1990-ish. Now, Japanese shrimp keepers were keeping them after taking Amano's lead of wanting some aquarium shrimp, especially wanting some smaller varieties to keep in nanotanks, which were a brand new concept as a movement in the hobby. Of course, small tanks existed, but as an art form, as aquascaping evolved as an art form, and CO2 injection and planted tanks and highlight and carpeting plants, all that came in, there was a real push for these shrimp to be kept, and the Japanese went out and tried to find as many different possible species as they could, and it started with 5 possible species that they started with and decided there's enough color and pattern here in the wild that I think we can create something cool early on. And the shrimp being kept by the Japanese, the Chinese, the Taiwanese, these shrimp keepers were predominantly keeping what were called cantonensis, or now we call logmani, or logmani rather. And in 1991, a Japanese aquarist named Hisayasu Suzuki, he acquired some of the mostly still wild black crystal shrimp, and these were black and clear striped shrimp that were still mostly wild, but they'd been bred a little bit here and there in aquariums, and they were higher order breeders, so they could be line bred, they could be selectively bred, spending their whole life in an aquarium. Now, back at the time, this shrimp did not yet have the white that you think of as a crystal red shrimp, or crystal black shrimp. And instead, they had a little bit of rusty, or sometimes like rusty red, or sometimes a off blue, kind of dark, blackish blue cobalt color to them on the sides of stripes. So the stripes were there, the clear spots were there, but the white was more of speckling. Sometimes you get one stripe or partial stripes, but it wasn't anything like what you think of today when you think of a crystal shrimp or a pure red line or whatever you want to throw out there. But by 1993, Mr. Suzuki had stabilized a solid black striped version of the wild shrimp that was breeding true with stripes like a tiger, and much to his surprise, by 1994, this line started throwing red mutants. So the first one he noticed was in 1994, and he found a black crystal shrimp, and they were called crystal because they were see-through like a crystal. He would later say that he saw the first one in 1994, and he set it aside and tried to care for it, but it just had too many health problems. It never reached adulthood. It only lived a few months, but he realized there's genetics, there's a possible mutation in this tank. So he set aside those shrimp of that generation from all the others, and within 18 months, in 1996, it happened again. The modern shrimp keeping hobby was truly born in 1996 when Mr. Suzuki was working with his shrimp tanks, and he noticed 3 this time, 3 baby shrimp with red stripes instead of black stripes, and still the clear in between. Now, these he was extremely excited about because by the beginning of 1995, his original crystal red had passed away, and he thought that was the end of the project potentially. But he was awarded a Japanese patent for genetics for the red crystal shrimp that he came up with, and was poised to make a great deal of money selling these shrimp while still retaining the rights to their name and likeness in Japan. So he actually set aside these shrimp. Luckily, he had 2 males and a female. I mean, I guess it would have been better to have females, but at least he had 3 of them. But he began to carefully line breed these 3 shrimp, and he bred them with their siblings in specific water parameters, and he strictly culled all the ones that were black and was just looking for red ones. Now, the ones that were black, he had in separate tanks nearby, and he was trying to hope that there'd be more random mutations. And whenever there were, he'd throw those back in with the others. So as you can see, the genetics are getting pretty bottlenecked here with that strict of a culling theory. So it is both the birth of the color morph craze in the shrimp hobby, but it is also the moment that a once hardy variant of the bee shrimp were genetically whittled down to a mere 3 individuals that were already inbred siblings that became our entire fancy shrimp hobby for the most part. So the first crystal red bee shrimp would be refined alongside the crystal blacks he was working on, and over the years he added more and more white to those clear spots along with fellow breeders. Now, some of these original shrimp actually auctioned off for up to $8,000 an individual, and they were brought back to Taiwan and to Hong Kong. From there, those were being bred, line bred, or crossed in some cases with the tangerine tiger shrimp, or with wild forms of those same logmani, which we used to call just the Japanese bees. So it further narrowed the gene pool with the Japanese crystals, whereas the ones that came out of there, actually it expanded their gene pool a little bit more, because the Taiwanese and the Hong Kong breeders, they were actually using facilities with millions of dollars in investment in some cases, and they were really trying to breed something special and quick ahead of the Japanese, and trying to get solid red, an all red shrimp, or maybe an all black shrimp, whatever it would be, any new variety. And soon they had their own crystal reds. And soon, by the end of the 90s, they began finding a lot more with the white instead of the clear, yet they kept the name crystal. Now, this is when the name bee shrimp started kind of coming along, because they had stripes like a bee. Originally in Japan, that was suggested in the 80s when they caught those wild specimens, but it never really caught on as a term in the hobby. But now it did, and anything with stripes was a bee shrimp, pretty much. And anything that was orange or blue with stripes was a Taiwanese tiger shrimp. And that's kind of how it went for a little while. But the wild shrimp that showed more blue or red in their stripes naturally were then bred alongside those red crystal shrimp. And by the year 2000, the crystal shrimp had actually given way to the bee, or the gold bee, the white bee, snow white, whatever you want to call them, shrimp, which were very, very white. Now, they started as kind of an off-white or buttercream, but over time, by the late 90s, early 2000s, they realized that the crystal shrimp alone, just with the Japanese genetics, that they could, the reds and the blacks, when you mix them, you could end up with different things. When you mixed a red and a red generation, you would get a red. But if you mixed a red and a black, and then the next generation a red and a expressing red from the other one, then they ended up with what we call mischlings under the German term, because it's also at this time, around the late 90s, that the Germans really started getting into this as well. And that basically just means mutts. And it's at this time that they started crossing wild shrimp and line-bred shrimp and getting both the cream variation of the yellow or white bee or gold bee shrimp, and also the first blue bolts, because the black actually was made up of a pigment that had blue chromatophores or pigmentation pixels of sorts, and it was possible to select for those from the wild stock. Now, that was completely different from the red ones. That was a different morph, but there were enough keepers at this point that they were trying mixing these up and crossing different things. So at this time, the Taiwanese breeders wanted to really pull ahead of the Japanese breeders who had the highest grade shrimp at the time, and were guarding their secrets as to what was mutating into which form, or which ones were being line bred, which ones were being hybridized, if any. And around this same time of the late 90s, early 2000s, it's very unclear who had the first what when, because some people had it and they didn't want to show it to the public until it was kind of solidified, until the line was at least 50% true or 100% true, or it was completely white and not just partially white. So there's a lot of disagreement about who had the first what when. But this is also the time when people are seeing that things are going for tens of thousands of dollars, so they better get in on it. And you see these big facilities popping up, especially in Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, and mainland China in Guangzhou, that they're breeding racks and racks and racks, just waiting for a mutation that's new, whether that's the Pintos dots, or fishbone on the back, stripes that don't go all the way around, or if it's stripes that go all the way around and have white all the way around. All of it is, if it's new, it's interesting and novel. And this is also when the first standards start to arise of triple S sometimes is standard, but usually SS, the S, then A, then B, then C are the grading scale from top to bottom quality. Now, this scale arises because there's so many culls that people are giving away or trying to sell for cheaper. All the while, these shrimp are still being kept in very specific water parameters, like that of the first Japanese ones from the early 90s. So, they weren't being bred to be hardy by any means. They were being bred to be beautiful. This is also the first time we see red wine, King Kong, Taiwan bee shrimp, and you also see the tiger Taiwan bee cross, so the hybridization. The Taiwanese breeders seem to have far more color morphs than the Japanese all of a sudden, and it's likely because they diversified the genetics, and they had crossed the Japanese bees with the existing Taiwanese bee lines that had been separate now for over 10 years from the Japanese lines, as well as introducing tigers and maybe other wild lines or wild morphs into those lines, and then crossing them back again with the crystals or with the blue bolts, whatever it may be, until it looked again like the line bred and not like a wild one. And this took 10 years in some cases. Some of these projects went on and on and on. And also during this time, you start to see people working on the pure red line or the pure black line that don't throw any other color morphs, so they're reliable. Because the problem with CARIDINA shrimp is, and why they fetch so much money, is you need to know the genetics of not just them, their parents, but their grandparents could impact, eye color, or whether they're going to throw another type of shrimp in 2 generations from now. And so you have to really keep track of years of work, and you're paying for that, plus the time, plus all the cold shrimp, not cold like blue, but cold or set aside. And I should say that also, that cold doesn't mean killed like it does in some circles. It means separated and set aside because even coals were worth money at this time. And the U.S. actually starts to see these coals around 2005. We don't really see the highest grade of shrimp, but you do see in Europe some of the higher grade shrimp getting into their hobby by that point. Now, by this time, we're seeing the fishbone, the pinto, the galaxy patterns, and many others. Later, there'd be the boa. There's just a lot that later, steel, metallic, all those different names. But it's around the same time that the Germans, the Dutch, and the Polish breeders also then formed expeditions to go back to Asia and import wild shrimp. And they wanted to try their own lines, and they wanted to try from scratch. So also, of course, because the competition did that, a lot of groups in Hong Kong and groups in Taiwan went back and they tried to create that first wild red crystal by going out and looking out of hundreds and hundreds of wild logmani shrimp. They would look for one that's already rusty red, start with that, and maybe one or two of them start with those, and they'd have a jump on that process, and then maybe they'd be able to kind of skip the line and have the newest thing that year. Now, this is also when you see the fact that the crystal shrimp are becoming more and more specialized and graded. So for about 10 years, you see that the crystal reds and crystal blacks start getting shown with 2 dots or 3 lines or 4 lines or 1 line or just red on the head. And in the case of the Polish breeder Monika Polar, she breeds a little symbol that looks like a guy dancing. It looks like a little stick figure, digitized stick figure almost. Someone else bred a smiley face. But, I mean, Monika Polar, she was bringing in like $500 to $1,000 easily for a single shrimp from these Japanese bee shrimp, which are crystal shrimp, crystal red and crystal black shrimp, that were just very high grade for the time. Some of these you can now get for $5 or $6, not the special dancing man ones, but something that would have been a grade triple S at the time or double S at the time, depending on the country and the rating system, now would be, a mediocre one because we've come so far. So that time period is also when Americans start getting on board, and you see people starting to keep shrimp and import shrimp, unfortunately with massive casualty rates, because Americans had been importing some tangerine tigers, some blue tangerine tigers, the Amano shrimp, and the Pinocchio shrimp, a few other wild strains that were kind of here and there for specialty markets. But they'd also been importing the Caridina, which were much more readily color shifting and available in a lot more wild morphs. Because in the wild, they had Shoko, which was like a chocolate color. They had the rusty kind. They had a whiter kind. They had a striped kind. So they have all these different variations in Caridina, and it made it so they never whittled down the genetics so badly that they were hard to keep. Now, that's all relative, because if you remember, like me, 15 or 20 years ago, it's been almost 20 years, 2003 was the first year that Caridina entered the U.S. in November of 2003. The first load came ashore, and I saw them around 2005 or 6, going for about $50 or $60 a shrimp. And I just thought, I can't deal with this. That's too expensive. I couldn't stand it if I lost it. But a couple of my friends that were keeping them, even with the Caridina's, they didn't quite understand the GH and KH and all that, and they weren't able to keep them very well. So it wasn't until the RO system, the remineralizers, Bacter AE, all these specialized products started to come out around 2010 or maybe a little earlier, that we start to see the ability for your average aquarist to keep these shrimp without years of practice or some insider knowledge. Now, prices for new and strange morphs at this time were still over $10,000 a shrimp in some cases. New breeding patterns on the shrimp, they meant that retail consumption was truly growing at a massive scale. Hong Kong and Taiwan became the main exporters of these shrimp strains at the time. And while I'd love to tell you that we have all the facts and info correct on what was being exported, academics are still in disagreement over the exact source of the wild stock they used to create all the shrimp at that time. Now, early on, we know what they were using because those lines have still been preserved. Suzuki's original crystal lines are still preserved in tanks in Japan and Europe and elsewhere. And we were able to test those and know that they were the Logmani, and know that early Tangerine Tiger lines that were kept separate were also the Mariae, but the later morphs that started to come about, that's when we need to do sequencing and genomics to figure things out. And in 2008, that was still pretty expensive, but a man by the name of Dr. Wang, who did a ton of research on small shrimp species, specifically freshwater, he started investigating and looking at the taxonomy of these creatures and trying to figure out what was what, other than just what the breeders were saying. So, and I quote from his paper, the first freshwater Attidiid genus CARIDINA contains a number of species which have become popular in the ornamental pet trade. All across the globe, the last couple of decades, the identities of two of these shrimp seem familiar. However, only now are we resolving the unknown identities of other members of these morphs. The ubiquitous tiger and bee shrimps have typically been considered to represent the phenotypical variants of a single species known as Caridina cantonensis from the Canton region of China, referred to as CCF, as in Caridina abbreviated CF, and CF means we're calling it this for now because we don't know any other name. So that's actually how they were being labeled at the time scientifically. It's not until now that we get rid of the CF because now we think we know what's going on. But more recently, Dr. Wang concluded that their new species were being bred into the mix, and they were found literally on the same tiny island in the mouth of the Pearl River Delta as the original Japanese bee shrimp and possibly some of the Taiwanese bee shrimp, in that they think now that some of the Taiwanese bee shrimp weren't bought from the Japanese and the crystal reds and so forth, crystal reds and blacks. They may have cut the line and gone back to the folks who sold the Japanese those and asked, hey, what island did you get those from? And so the team went back under Dr. Wang, and they went to go to this island and examine what was there. And together they were able to find out that there was new species altogether that weren't documented. The Caridina maculata, the Caridina venusta, and together the ornamental bee shrimp. But new research by the German team Werner Klotz and Thomas von Rintelen suggests something contradictory to what Dr. Wang was saying. So in their study, they published in a issue of the journal Zootaxia, and it comprises of taxonomic revisions and molecular phylogenetic analysis of the Caridina species native to the Guangdong province and the Pearl River Delta in southern China, and specifically in Hong Kong. And some of these shrimp literally are found in the city of Hong Kong, still in the polluted banks of creeks and rivers. These guys are still there. So out of the 300 Caridina species we have now, and the over 2,000 small or dwarf species of shrimp that are freshwater that we know are in Asia and the Pacific Islands, this is such a small fraction that we'd been breeding. And it expands a bit when you realize that our Neocaridina are not just Neocaridina davidi, as it was called, but they're actually Zangagensis, they're Palmata, and they may be even a few other kinds that's still being sorted. But they decided also that the tiger shrimp that was once named the Caridina serrata was now Caridina mariae, and that was the German team Klotz and von Rintelen in 2014, and they said that they can be distinguished from the similar shrimp on the same tiny island that's less than the size of Central Park by their striking color pattern, which consists of semi-transparent bodies with dark brown to blackish blotches and stripes on the lower portion of their carapace. A series of similar colored stripes on the posterior part of the carapace, and the first 6 abdominal segments lack any dark markings other than the ones that are finally found on the fanned out tail of the shrimp. And it's because of these color morphologies and the exact body shapeage, the amount of armor plates and the antennae and the number of notches on the antennae and the shape of things, the ratio of things, that they are deciding this. And the C. mariae was named in honor of, or Caridina, sorry, when I say C, that's just short for Caridina. Mariae was named in honor of the first author's wife, Maria, for her support during several field trips and her abundance of patience with a author with a myopic view and obsessive lifestyle of trying to track down the history and natural evolution of these shrimp. Apparently a lot of hours were spent by the microscope and her bringing him food. Sounds familiar. Thanks, honey. Anyhow, it is currently known from 2 localities in neighboring counties within southern China, the Yangdi and the Konghigua counties within the Guangdong province of southern China, but they can also be found elsewhere according to local fishermen and local buyers for the hobby. They say that northern Vietnam also has some of these exact same species, but one of these habitats that they're found in now in 2014 during this paper, it comprised of a hill stream with a pH of 6.2, and yet they found also the same species in a swampy area on the island with a pH of 7.1, and that's both where different color morphs of the Caridina mariae was found. And so they said alongside with the Caridina cantonensis and the second new species, Caridina congruensis, documented by Dr. Klotz and Dr. von Rintelen in 2014, the species was then named for the part of the island that it was on, specifically the southern part, and by the dark blue and blackish stripes or pigment that are seen under the microscope on those bodies. So it turns out that it was probably just 2 color morphs of the same shrimp, which originally would have been called Caridina cantonensis, but now they've changed that. And then even the tiger shrimp probably came from there and not Taiwan as once believed. And they also are from this same tiny little island out in the Pearl Sea Delta, or the Pearl River Delta. And so it really is mind-blowing that out of all the species that are available on all the hills and stuff, that they picked one from one little harbor island, and that became Japan's, and then another one from the same freaking island gets picked as the one that Taiwan decides to go with for the first 15 years or so. Now, there are also variations and morphological differences between all of these new species that the Germans classified. The third new species described in this same paper was, of course, Caridina logmani, or the original Japanese bee shrimp, taking over the cantonensis label. And it appears that it closely resembles the original aquarium bee shrimp and bolt shrimps, and it is known only from 3 small hill streams in the region of Hong Kong in the mouth of the Pearl Delta. And it was collected from leaf litter between boulders in shallow water with a pH of 6.0, which could explain why the Japanese and Mr. Suzuki thought that it needed to be that such soft water with such specific parameters. And it could have been that he actually was shaping things based on monsoon season in a gully where they were collected, and that was the data reading at the time for what these wild shrimp needed. But in fact, they could have tolerated 7.2 water on the other side of the island just fine, and they might have looked a little different. So no other shrimp species have been collected from those streams, but large populations and more widely distributed Caridina, or what they used to call Cantonensis, are found on neighboring islands also with different markings. So it could be that those were the ones that were collected from the wild later, to mix back in with the genes and also to try to get new traits. Now, the 2 species exhibit significant differences in coloration, with Caridina logmani possessing a series of large brown blackish markings, whereas the Caridina cantonensis possesses numerous small spots but is otherwise clear. So they decided that the cantonensis was just a wrong name, but cantonensis was a species that already existed. So this whole confusing mess goes on where they say, okay, so the Japanese bee shrimp are no longer cantonensis, they're logmani. But wait, cantonensis still exists, they're just a different shrimp from that same island and from a different drainage. So again, the species is named in honor of those German aquarists, Karsten and Frank Logman, for their long-lasting, quote, work on bee shrimp and the aquarium pets trade and their support of shrimp research in Hong Kong. Now, the story does not end with the 3 new species, because a paper published after all this in 2020 revisits the studies published by Dr. Wang and by the Germans, and it describes 4 more Caridina species from this exact same region. And that are the Caridina maculata, the Caridina venusta, the Caridina timida, and the Caridina meridionalis, along with the original Caridina maculata and Caridina venusta, which had already been described. They're kind of just reaffirming that description. But they were depicted as possessing a color pattern comprising of alternating light and dark bands, and Wang assumed them to be ornamental species that were originally exported to Japan as bee shrimp. So this opinion has not been widely adapted, and the genetic testing done seems to indicate that it could be a mix of that later on, but it's probably the first part that I said. So you can kind of ignore that the change and the finding of the new 4 species. Those may have been introduced into the Japanese logmani, once referred to as cantonensis line of crystal shrimp and Japanese bee shrimp. They could have been introduced in the 2000s as things were changing and needing more genetic diversity in order to get new morphs that weren't completely inbred and useless. But there were other shrimp nearby that could have explained it also. And then now finally, with genetic field work being done, we're seeing maps of the genetics, and you can actually see from every island, even if they're the same species, how different the phenotypes are, the expression of how they can look. And it's really interesting because based on the material that Wang published in 2018, Klotz and von Rintelen, I can't say that name, concluded that the images in Wang's paper of Caridina maculata were actually Caridina venusta. And the other team that went there to find those 4 new species in 2020 said that the image of that Caridina maculata was actually the Caridina timida. So all of this is really confusing recently, and I wasn't able to make any videos, even though I had wanted to, because it sounded like we were about to make a huge breakthrough. But really, in the end, they came up with there being a total of 6 species on this one island in particular, and along the coastal ranges, with many, many more species elsewhere. And then within each species, there being a wide array of color morphs. And get this, it turns out that the colors are so variable between banding and spangling, sparkling, white segments, and just different shapes, tail fans that are colorful, tail fans that aren't, that all these shrimp may actually just be one big species on the island, according to some people. And only one of them, when genetically analyzed, was moved into a different group, which was Paracaridina instead of Caridina. And in Paracaridina, they named one of these newly found shrimp, once they did the genetic work, they named it Zijinica. So Zigenisa, I don't know how to say it. And that was a Dr. Liang who first found them in 2002, and then later they confirmed that they were Paracaridina. They're not in the hobby yet to any degree, but all those other 6 or 5 maybe now, the Caridina trifasciata, which was discovered by Yam and Kay in 2003, Professor Yam and Kay, and also the species which was discovered by Sai Kung in the Hong Kong district on the Hang Quin Islands in Guangdong, right across from Hong Kong. They found even more species that had bluish bands and way thicker bands that look a lot closer to what we see in the hobby. So now the question is, did any hobby shrimp get dumped back to any of these places, considering some of them are right in the city of Hong Kong itself? Because they know on the island of Taiwan, there are shrimp that were not native there that have now colonized the coast. So all 5 samples of ornamental bee shrimp grouped together Caridina cantonensis in the phylogenetic analysis at the end of the day, suggesting that it is a genuine ancestor of the aquarium-bred, line-bred form of crystal reds, king kongs, blue bolts. Despite lacking any banded color in the wild, the single aquarium specimen with the morphology identical to Caridina logmani, or as it was called cantonensis, also clustered together with the new wild cantonensis, which is a possible indicator that they hybridized. And that could have been some of the confusion. Maybe when the Japanese first got them, they looked like cantonensis, and logmani had not been described yet. Also, Caridina venusta hadn't been described yet either. So they were going off of what they knew to exist, and they didn't see the weird color morphs. Now, that venustus is also sometimes called the Hong Kong diamond bee shrimp, because during that rush for new species and new morphs, the Hong Kong breeders, including Vin, they were able to collect wild species that were way closer to, say, a blue bolt, when they would find a striped blue and clear species, and they then just took that and selected it, crossed it with a bolt from the Taiwanese, and boom, they had a new grade of blue bolt ahead of the curve of everyone with a much darker blue. And so there's stuff like this that went on that nobody will admit to necessarily, or some people will, or some people will throw other people off by saying it was some other combo. But the genetics don't lie. So we know that the shrimp mixed at some point, and the presence of several similar looking species, and this is not just to your average Joe, this is to the people looking under the microscope, suggests that Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta were home to at least 5 different species of the Caridina, 1 species of the Paracaridina, and that 2 species account for the bee shrimp and the Thai bee shrimp, the Japanese bee shrimp, and the other one. Now, all of this leads us to the somewhat frustrating conclusion that the species of shrimp you keep could be a mix of any 5 of those Caridina in theory, depending on which breeder you got them from. You know, there's breeders now in Vietnam, there's breeders in Indonesia, there's collectors that go to Germany, in Germany that go to the region and get new stock. There's things like raccoon or cheetah or all sorts of other new shrimp out there that are being crossed in from other Caridina lines. And so there you have it, my friends. The entire confusing and muddled history of the bee shrimp, the tiger shrimp, the first Japanese lines of crystal shrimp, the slightly sturdier Taiwanese bee shrimp, and the later, even more sturdy tiger Thai bee or Thai bee shrimp, and rounding it out with all of these variations was the crazy gold rush on shrimp by the 2010s that saw all sorts of secretive breeding and collecting of wild populations that muddles the water completely for what we were breeding. And if it weren't for those diehard Japanese and Taiwanese keepers that kept some of the original lines, we would have never known where the original morph came from, because it could have been all overshadowed by the hybridization. So it's pretty amazing how all of that ended up. I mean, what are the chances? So regardless of how confusing this has all become, the bee shrimp lines have become far more hardy than the early lines bred in Japan or Taiwan or anywhere. And they were created just from a species or two and morphs and line breeding. And now we know that there's this wide range of hybridization that can go on. And you have to keep up with making the colors look cool again. But also you get new morphs like the metallic morphs, like the boa patterns, like the herringbone patterns, or like stardust shrimp, where there's a new wild shrimp that has all these speckles and things. And we're still trying to figure out what some of these are, if they're just type specific or if they are actually new unique mutations, because there's a big difference between nature doing it and us doing it and then selectively line breeding it, because when nature does it, generally it's going to be safer in the aquarium under a wider array of parameters. So luckily this secrecy is not really the state of things in the shrimp hobby quite as much these days, and now people want you to find success with water parameters and keeping your shrimp. And so now the information is becoming more accessible than ever, but because of this really confusing past that I hope I untangled for you shrimp nerds out there, now we can kind of see why so much information saying, you should do this. Oh, in the wild, these shrimp live this way. Try to emulate that. Oh, in this guy's tank, he uses this line. Well, a lot of it just was throwing people off, because there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even there are millionaires that were made from this. And so it was very secretive and proprietary. So if you guys made it all the way to this end, thank you so much for following me on this wild journey. And if you're here at the end, you know, the end where we typically end things, I owe you a sincere thank you. And also to my members, you guys make all of this possible. You make these deep dives possible. And you allow me to document something that I've spent 6 years trying to make sense of. It looked like one of those murder mysteries with yarn strings everywhere and a cork board. And then I pulled it all down and started over, and notes in several different phones. Had to revive zombie phones that haven't been used in years from notes that I had at one point. And, you know, in the end, genetics untangles it all for us. Well, all but the story of how we got to the point where the genetics got so muddled. But thank you guys. You let me present this as a somewhat coherent story. And if you like this content, please consider turning on the bell for alerts for my new videos. And if you really, really enjoy it and you're not already one of my amazing supporters and producers and curators of the channel, that's a member. I made it as cheap as it possibly can be, $1.99. And for $1.99, you can keep my research going and become a member. So thank you all so very much. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you guys on the next episode of The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium. Take care. And if you made it to the end, say the word rice somewhere in your comment if you leave one, and I'll know you're one of the ride or die true hardcore shrimp nerds. All right, guys, thank you so much. Bye.